I'm Allison. I'm the Executive Director for the Gender Center in Eugene, Oregon.
Hi there, I'm Cecily Griffiths, LGBTQ, Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Advocacy Specialist with the Safe Choice Program at the YWCA in Clark County, Vancouver, Washington.
My name is Gabby Santos, and I'm the Program Coordinator for Underserved Communities with the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and we are all members of the Steering Committee for the Gender Positive Shelter Accessibility Committee. We are now changing our name, though, to the Gender Positive Systems Advocacy Committee to capture more primary prevention work throughout the state.
This podcast features elements of a statewide conference call that happened last year in 2010. This was a partnership with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. And if you would like to receive the full audio of this podcast, we can email it to you at your request.
Thank you for tuning in.
So welcome, and thank you for participating in the Fair Housing Rights for Transgender and Gender Non-Conforming Survivors of Domestic and Sexual Violence. This is a training sponsored by Gender Positive Shelter Accessibility Committee, GPSAC, in partnership with Fair Housing Council of Oregon. My name is Gabby Santos. I'm the Program Coordinator for Underserved Communities with the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence.
I'm Cecily Griffiths, LGBTQ Advocacy Specialist with the Safe Choice Program in Vancouver, Washington.
I'm Allison Cleveland. I'm the Executive Director and Program Coordinator for the Gender Center in Eugene, Oregon.
And I'm Aloy Good, the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon.
So this training will help us further examine fair housing rights, particularly gender as a protected class, as it applies to gender and shelter services. GPSAC responds to technical assistance calls when programs are interested in providing gender-positive services. And although we do provide services when it comes to culturally safer strategies, best practices around that when working with trans and gender non-conforming, we are not attorneys. We have been receiving legal calls around gender as it applies to shelter, and because of that, we have reached out to Aloy Good from the Fair Housing Council of Oregon to really guide us through some of the information that will be helpful as we look into serving trans and gender non-conforming survivors. A couple of housekeeping items for those on the call in order for the call to run smoothly.
As wide a group as possible. My presentation is going to be pretty simple. I'm going to cover three main areas and then be available to take questions at the end. I'll also stop at various points and ask if there are any questions, and folks are free to ask at that time, but we may move it along just because of the time constraints. So to begin with, I just wanted to give a very brief overview of what fair housing is and what exactly it protects. So there are three levels of laws that have to do with fair housing when I talk about fair housing laws. There are laws at the federal level, there are laws at the state level, and then there are laws at your local city or county level, or there can be. At the federal level, the Fair Housing Act is what provides the greatest and broadest protection, and the Fair Housing Act was originally passed in 1968, and it protects everybody in housing transactions based on their race, their color, their gender, their national origin, their religion, their familial status, meaning whether or not they have kids, and their disability, be it physical or mental. And so the federal law applies throughout all 50 states, and so that includes Oregon and Washington for our folks over there. The state of Oregon has gone further than that. In addition to those protected classes, they have added over the years marital status and source of income, and then very recently in 2008 they added sexual orientation and included as part of sexual orientation gender identity. The one note on source of income, typically what that protects is people who are receiving some sort of government benefit, and if a landlord were to say, no, you receive welfare, I don't want to rent to you because of that, that would be illegal. It would not be illegal for a landlord to say, well, because you only receive welfare, you don't make enough money to afford the rent here, and therefore I'm not going to rent to you. So just keep in mind that distinction. Cities and counties across Oregon have added have added even more protection. Until 2008, several cities and counties protected sexual orientation, and some also protected gender identity. Now that's protected across the state, Portland and Multnomah County, I think, are the only ones. They add age over the age of 18 as a protected class, and then the city of Portland also protects people based on their occupation. So that would be a circumstance where landlord said, I'm sorry, I don't like timber workers or fishery workers or whatever, I'm not going to rent to you. We don't see that come up a lot, but it does from once in a while. So the next two parts of my presentation, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what constitutes a dwelling, which for purposes of the fair housing laws is important because they apply to what we call dwellings. And then after I've gone over that a little bit, I will talk more specifically about the protected classes of gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity, with the main focus being on gender identity. So anyway, so dwelling, I know that this issue comes up a lot, especially when it applies to shelters and sort of non-traditional housing situations. But the courts over the years have identified two main, well, what they've said is that you must look at the situation on a case-by-case basis, whether or not a place is considered a dwelling. And there are two levels of inquiry that they use to arrive at that determination. One is whether or not the facility itself was intended or designed for occupants to remain for a significant amount of time. And then the second level of inquiry is, do the residents themselves view the facility as a place where they can return to and stay? So what we have developed, or what has come out of all of this, is some key factors to look at when trying to figure out whether or not the shelter you're operating would or could be considered a dwelling. These are not, these are just several factors to look at. No one factor of them is going to be more important than any of the others. So it's not necessarily a checklist to be like, okay, well, we don't have all of these, so therefore we're not a dwelling. You could have a couple of them and be considered a dwelling. So one key factor is whether or not there is any kind of formal or informal agreement between the resident and the provider. That could be, most traditionally we look at that as a rental agreement where, it's a lease or some other sort of agreement that the two people sign and execute, or, they just have a verbal understanding, yeah, you can live here, and stay. Another key factor is whether or not there's any kind of bartered exchange. Traditionally, that is rent. So do you pay money in order to entitle you to live in a certain place on a periodic basis, whether it's week to week or month to month or for a set period of time? Are you paying money? But don't get hung up on, well, we do charge people, but we don't call it rent. It's any kind of fee or any other kind of requirement, whether it's an exchange of services. Yeah, I'll let you live here if you promise to clean out my barn every month or every week or whatever. So it doesn't have to be just some kind of monetary exchange. And sometimes attending a requirement that you attend meetings as part of the household could be considered, something in that bartered exchange that you're doing. You as the provider are requiring someone to do something they would not otherwise have to do or want to do, and you as the consumer are being required to do something that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily do. The information I'm going to talk about now, like I said earlier, has to do with the protected classes of gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And so my comments here are drawn from a lot of the feedback we've received from shelters, a lot of the questions we've gotten over time as it relates to these protected classes. They all, in the end, seem to focus mostly on, how to handle someone who is presenting themselves as a gender that may not be the gender that they were assigned at birth, and what kind of issues come up with that. So they all sort of tie together in a very broad sense. But as I said earlier, sexual orientation and gender identity were added to Oregon State's Civil Rights Act in 2008, and one of the key things about the law is it protects people not just based on their actual or identified sexual orientation or gender identity, but it also protects them based on their perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. So, housing providers that will encounter somebody and say, they look like they might be gay or lesbian, and even though they may not be, there would still be protection for that person if they were treated differently. So that kind of moves me to the issue of gender identity, and again, what we're talking about here are individuals who identify themselves as with a gender that was not the gender that they were assigned with at birth. Now, this can be true. When someone can have gender identity protection regardless of whether or not they have completed a sex reassignment surgery, are in the process of preparing to complete such a surgery, or have any desire at all to complete such a surgery. There's no requirement that they be at any particular point along that continuum in order to get this protection.
My name is Malloy Good, and I'm the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. Gender identity protections in housing are relatively new to Oregon. However, we continue to work together to make all housing available to people regardless of gender identity. To that end, the Fair Housing Council of Oregon is available as a resource for technical assistance and guidance, so please feel free to contact us. Thank you.
And if you would like to receive the full audio of this podcast, we can email it to you at your request.
Thank you. Okay. And we can all say thank you together. I can splice like a whole thank you together, or what do you want to say? Oh, thank you for tuning in, right?
Thank you for tuning in.
Okay, let's say that, and then I can splice it at the end.
Thank you for tuning in.
Okay.
You want to say it all the same time?
Live from Portland!
It's Saturday night.
1, 2, 3. Thank you for tuning in.
3.
Thank you for.
This is hard.
I'll tell you guys, I wasn't going to say this, but I am a film director.
Oh, thank you.
Give you 2 and then point and then say thank you for tuning in. Okay? Ready?
Okay.
Thank you for tuning in. Thank you.
How was that?
Yeah, that's everything we need.
My union will send you a bill.